Hello, everyone, and welcome to this morning's or this afternoon's, depending on where you are, webinar. I'm Lalita Duperon. I'm in the Center for South Asia at Stanford. And before we start, I want to recognize that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We are indeed grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity with Indigenous struggles. Now, we know that Indigenous people are in fact massively impacted by climate change, even though Indigenous communities rarely contribute to the systems that create climate disasters. And today we are indeed going to talk about that very topic, how people that suffer the consequences of climate change and weather disaster do not on the whole contribute to it, and what can be done to correct that wrong. And I was listening to programs during the Pakistan floods last year at the end of summer, and the topic of reparations came up, quote unquote reparations. That was the word that was used, and I became fascinated by it as just in terms of policy, how would that work? And I wanted to hold a webinar about it, but I didn't know really who to invite. And so I reached out to my friend and colleague, Arzan Tarapor at the Shorenstein A-Park Research Center here at Stanford. And he put me in touch with the panelists of today. And so a big vote of thanks to him. Then COP27 happened in November 22, and the issue of reparations did indeed come up. It was reframed perhaps as loss and damage. And so everything kind of led towards this webinar happening. And here we are. And I'm so grateful to Stanford Global Studies and also the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford for their sponsorship of today's event. We're going to be wrapping up at about 11:15 Pacific time. That's 2:15 Eastern time. So you can pace yourself in terms of Q&A. For questions, we use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen, and we will try and get to all the questions. I will now introduce our moderator, and then we'll pass on the mic to her. So the moderator today, and I'm so grateful to you for taking on this role, is Elizabeth Threlkeld. She is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center. Before joining Stimson, she served as a foreign service officer with the US Department of State in Islamabad and Peshawar. She holds an MPhil in politics and international relations from the University of Cambridge, and her research interests include South Asian geopolitics, ethno-nationalist conflict, and territorial disputes. Elizabeth, I'm so happy you're here and so honored to be in your company. Please take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Lolita, for convening us today and for that very kind introduction. I am really looking forward to the discussion we're going to have today, and I'm pleased to be joined in conversation with two insightful colleagues who I think are very well placed to help us contextualize the events that have unfolded in Pakistan with the flooding, the recovery, the response, and kind of this question of where we go from here, right? As conversations in the international community, the UN and elsewhere, surround the question of loss and damage, I think it is a timely discussion to drill a little bit deeper, to look at what that means specifically in the context of Pakistan, the areas of the country where these floods have affected people the most, political and economic ramifications, lessons learned from this flooding episode, previous flooding episodes, to help us hopefully chart a course for managing these sorts of climate disasters going forward, which unfortunately look likely to continue. So lessons that are in need of learning sooner rather than later, to be sure. To kick things off, I am going to introduce both of my colleagues and then hand over the mic to them for some opening remarks. So first, we have Farwa Aamer, my colleague at the Stimson Center. She's a research analyst with our Energy, Water, and Sustainability program. Her research focuses primarily on the security and political dimensions of transboundary water governance in the Himalayan region. So Farwa periodically organizes and convenes track 2 dialogues and discussions designed to facilitate regional cooperation on issues around water security and hydro diplomacy. She has worked extensively in South Asia, Central Asia, and in the Euphrates Tigris River Basin. Prior to joining Stimson, she served as the director of the South Asia program at the East-West Institute and received a master's in management with finance from BPP London Business School. Secondly, we have Madiha Afzal, who is a fellow in the foreign policy program at Brookings. Her work focuses on the US-Pakistan relationship, US policy towards Afghanistan, politics and policy in Pakistan, and extremism in South Asia and more broadly. She previously worked as an assistant professor of public policy at the University of Maryland, College Park, and is the author of a great book, Pakistan Under Siege, Extremism, Society, and the State. She received her doctorate in economics from Yale in 2008, specializing in development economics and political economy. So with that, in the interest of time, so we have plenty of time for discussion and Q&A, I'm going to turn things over to Farwa for remarks and then on to Madiha. Farwa, over to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And of course, thank you to the Center of South Asia at Stanford and Alita and Simret for organizing this very important discussion. I'm delighted to be here and to be able to speak to the intensifying challenges of climate change and related hazards. I know we're here to discuss Pakistan, but I do want to open with a few words on the absolutely devastating earthquake that gripped Turkey and parts of Syria, where the death toll now has risen to over 40,000. This has been another striking example of how natural disasters are wreaking havoc across the globe and highlights the need for greater climate resilience, adaptation, and mitigation. But coming to our topic at hand now, last year, Pakistan grappled, and in many ways is still grappling, with the worst flooding episode in recent history. Almost 1/3 of the country was underwater, with more than 30 million people affected and almost 500,000 people displaced and pushed into relief camps. The immediate cause of this apocalyptic flooding was, of course, connected to the torrential monsoon rainfall. Pakistan received 190% of its normal rainfall in July and August of 2022. And that's a massive number. But I understand that by now we've, of course, gone through the climate science of it ample times, so I will not dive too much into it. But to kind of sum it up, I think the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres aptly called the event a monsoon on steroids that requires urgent and collective action. The threat, however, lies in the reoccurrence of such monsoon periods, in the absence of proper early warning systems, adaptation, and rehabilitation mechanisms, especially for an economically and politically fragile country like Pakistan. Even months after the floods, vast areas of croplands and villages today remain underwater. Agriculture prices are increasing, further pushing food prices and heightening the risk of food insecurity across the nation. In addition to that, nearly 10 million young girls and boys remain in need of immediate life-saving support. In fact, UNICEF reported that by mid-January of this year, as many as about 4 million children were still living near contaminated and stagnant flood waters, risking their survival, health, and overall well-being. Now, what is it that needs to be done? And what needs to be improved to successfully deal with these overwhelming ramifications? And we can go back a little in the timeline and see how the Pakistan government and other national and international stakeholders navigated the previous flooding episodes. The 2010 floods in Pakistan, for example, affected over 20 million people and caused widespread damage to homes, infrastructure, and crops. At that time, the government had put in place various plans to deal with the loss and damage, including disaster response and relief efforts, and of course, setting up the National Disaster Management Authority. However, the success of these plans were very limited. Even now, over a decade since then, Pakistan unfortunately has not done enough to prepare for floods or natural disasters in general, while countries with similar risk profiles, such as Nepal, have done way more in terms of investing in disaster risk response and building climate resilient infrastructure. The 2022 flooding was a wake-up call for the nation and the entire globe. The lack of foresight-based planning and reactionary policy making has led to many people across Pakistan still kind of fending for themselves when natural disasters strike. And it's the welfare organizations that end up playing the greatest role in rescue and relief. The recovery and reconstruction needs, just to give you an estimate, alone are projected to be at 1.6 times the budgeted national development expenditure for the financial year of 2023. So it's time we recalibrate and employ a big picture approach. The Loss and Damage Fund from COP27 and the International Conference on Climate-Resistant Pakistan, which is hosted by UN in Geneva in January of this year, are great steps. But these need to fast translate into proactive and actionable items, including investments in more effective nationwide early warning systems, improving infrastructure, upgrading drainage and irrigation systems, developing means for rainwater harvesting, and other such techniques. It also requires regularly working with international agencies and partners at the top level, but also engaging with local communities to build their capacity and awareness to respond to disasters and empower them to be a part of the solution as well. I do want to wrap up by drawing attention to something that's, sorry, pardon the traffic noise here, draw everyone's attention to something very close to my heart, and that is the impact on women and other marginalized groups. Climate disasters such as floods have a profound impact on vulnerable communities, and it is clear that women and girls are often disproportionately affected. Women and children are approximately 14 times more likely than men to receive fatal casualties when disasters strike. From being immediately deprived of economic and educational opportunities to increased risk of gender-based violence and even reduced access to sexual and reproductive health services, the aftermath of a flood can have far-reaching consequences for women and girls. Last November, the United Nations Population Fund had reported that more than 400,000 women were currently pregnant in the flood-affected regions of Pakistan, with another 136,000 women expected to give birth in the next 3 months. This is an exceptionally important health challenge, one that demands urgent attention. Undoubtedly, the scale of recent flooding in Pakistan was certainly unprecedented. The extremely consequential levels of humanitarian, infrastructural, and economic destruction experienced are colossal. As the government of Pakistan and international agencies and partners work to support the flood victims and develop greater climate resilience for the future, they must also account for the role and needs of women. Thank you, everyone, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions. And with that, I'll pass the floor on to Madiha.
Thank you, Farwa. Thanks to Lolita and Stanford for convening this discussion. Thanks to Elizabeth for the introduction. I want to start out by contextualizing the flooding, the scale of which Farwa described, and I'll also add on to, in the context of the political and economic context in Pakistan, which has been very, very troubled over the last year. And the fact that this enormous natural disaster did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in this troubled environment, and that has impeded flood relief and recovery and will continue to impede flood relief and recovery. So I want to contextualize things to start off. Then I'll turn a little bit to the climate justice aspect of things and the Pakistani government's advocacy abroad, and in particular at COP27, and then end by, again, talking about sort of the domestic context. So this flooding that has been, perhaps mostly been described as biblical, catastrophic, apocalyptic, because no words are have been enough to kind of convey the extent of the damage. Left a third of Pakistan underwater. It submerged entire villages. It left lakes where there used to be villages, killed more than 1,700 people, affected and displaced millions, and destroyed enormous amounts of infrastructure and millions of acres of farmland. And it hit rural Sindh, it hit Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and it hit Balochistan. So, large parts of the country, but also very politically marginalized parts of the country. And that has affected the attention this has received domestically. So I'll come back to that, but I wanted to point that out. But biblical, apocalyptic, those are some of the words used, but I'll sort of describe it in some other words. Samantha Power, the USAID administrator, when she went to Pakistan, said, "I've never seen so much water on land." Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, she visited Pakistan as well, and she described it. She said, "As far as the eye could see, I saw water. We were the first US delegation to visit the most devastating and deadly flooding in Pakistan history, a flood of historic proportion, really a monster of a disaster." UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also visited, and he called it a climate catastrophe. And we'll come back again, as I said, to the climate aspect of this. Just in terms of sort of damage, the UN report that came out in September, the situation report, and the UN has been doing regular situation reports, which have actually been very, very helpful, far more helpful in some sense than anything the Pakistani government or its National Disaster Management Authority has put out. These kind of contextualize the extent of the damage even further. So more than 1 million houses damaged, 765,000 houses destroyed. You have more than 12,000 kilometers of roads damaged, and about 80% of crops in Sindh province, one of the 4 provinces in Pakistan, which used to produce 30% of Pakistan's total cotton output, were destroyed. And there were sort of very evocative images of reporters wading through cotton fields with the cotton completely destroyed, sort of brown and either submerged, or even the cotton that was salvaged just completely destroyed. So just sort of the extent of the damage is kind of mind-boggling. Now to the context. Even before the flooding, the context is important. We're hearing about Pakistan on the brink of economic default right now, but this is not a situation that arose post-flooding. This is a situation that the flooding, sort of occurred in the middle of. So in August, when the flooding occurred, Pakistan was 6 weeks away from default. The inflation that was occurring in August was 45% week on week. So just the extent of how much people were already hurting. Of course, politically, there had been a vote of no confidence in April that ousted then Prime Minister Khan, who led after April, rallies across the country asking for early elections. The mood in Pakistan was politics all the time. I was visiting Pakistan in August, and right at the time that the flooding was occurring in an urban area, so not where the flooding was occurring. But even as this was happening, the news on TV screens, what Pakistanis were consumed in discussions by was the fact that the arrest of Imran Khan might be imminent. And what consumed media and Pakistan's leaders, frankly, both the government as well as the politicians, was politics. So the focus on flooding, when it happened, when the government finally belatedly declared a national emergency, the focus on the flooding was brief, it was delayed, and soon after that, a couple of weeks was all it took, sort of the end of August, early September, and then, Pakistan was back to politics. I want to frame the context now, which is actually even worse than it was in August. The economy is in actually a much worse spiral right now, for reasons I can go into, but Pakistan basically has less than $3 billion in reserves currently, which is just a couple of weeks of import cover. And it has an IMF program that is currently stalled until an IMF tranche their negotiations and discussions to reach a deal. And the hope is that a deal would be reached, but it's not going to be a smooth road, let's just say. The IMF tranche that will come through, if the deal is reached, hopefully it comes through, say, at the earliest by next month, subject to the IMF board and the staff approving it, will release only $1.1 billion to Pakistan. That's not enough even to stave off default right? So this is flooding aside. This is a country that stands on the verge of default. Of course, Pakistan is then looking to funding from Saudi Arabia, China, the UAE, friendly nations, then looking perhaps to what will be even more difficult debt restructuring and post-debt restructuring as well. There have to be really sort of structural economic reforms that none of Pakistan's political parties or any of Pakistan's leaders have ever shown that they have the will to undertake. So it is a country in sort of a state of economic crisis right now, and a country that also has kind of a deep set economic malaise. And it is in this context that it is going to have to undertake flood recovery. Domestically, the incumbent government currently looks beleaguered, sort of mired in crises, both political and economic, and there's also insecurity. There was an attack at a mosque in Peshawar that killed scores of policemen. So sort of that is the context. And that is the context in which flood relief and recovery will have to occur. And we know that implementing any kind of sustainable recovery, and I'm going to come to numbers now, or in a little bit, will require enormous capacity. It will require resources. It will require transparency in a country that may not be ready to take on all of those things. The external environment is also important to mention here. There is sort of fatigue when it comes to donors, just because there are so many other disasters in the world, natural disasters, also wars, right? So this came, the flooding came in the context of 6 months after the Russian war in Ukraine began, and the world's attention was on that. So Pakistan did, in the context of so many crises competing for the world's attention, did suffer from a bit of a sympathy and an empathy deficit. And I think that's also important to acknowledge at the beginning. And initially, when the need, it was clear, was in the billions, and I'll talk about the exact numbers. The amount that Pakistan had coming through was really in the millions, right? So the needs that it had were not being met by donors. Now, I want to shift a little bit to talking about climate change, the government's external advocacy, and come back to the internal environment. On climate change, the Secretary General, when he visited Pakistan, called it a climate catastrophe, the UN Secretary General. And Farwa also mentioned he called it a monsoon on steroids, directly linking the flooding to climate change. And of course, we know both Pakistan's, the heat wave that happened earlier in the summer that contributed to melting glaciers, and then the torrential monsoon rains led to the flooding. And, attribution scientists, this sort of specific field has attributed the flooding disaster to climate change. So the discussion was framed, Pakistan very early on, it has a savvy, smart Minister for Climate Change, Sherry Rahman, who had just started with the new government in April last year, framed the discussion in terms of climate justice. And, they had a powerful advocate in Secretary General Guterres. Initially the conversation, as Lolita has said, started out talking about reparations, but quickly moved to sort of the more palatable sort of concept of loss and damage. But even then, it wasn't clear that the conversation was going to go anywhere. And Pakistan's advocacy externally has been extraordinarily effective in first getting loss and damage placed on the agenda at COP27 for the first time, and then pushing for COP delegates in Egypt to agree to a loss and damage fund. But this is a long-term proposition. This is not something that's going to help Pakistan right away. Right. So while the Pakistani government has been very effective on this front, and that's commendable, this is not something that's helping even bring in funding. The Loss and Damage Fund is not bringing in funding for Pakistan's 2022 flood relief and recovery. And The Economist actually, when it sort of talked about Pakistan's leadership on this, said this is a country not known for leadership at home, it provides some abroad, and it's quite aptly put there. Of course, Pakistan had a very good case to be made, and its prime minister, foreign minister also went to Egypt. And the fact is that Pakistan is responsible for less than 1% of global carbon emissions, but it is the 8th most climate vulnerable country in the world. And that, I think, sort of lays the case right there. In any case, also in terms of generating funding, the foreign minister visited DC twice after the flooding, in the fall, and the prime minister also visited at the UN General Assembly, advocated for nations to, pay attention to Pakistan's climate catastrophe. The second thing they've done is that a donors conference that Prime Minister Sharif co-hosted with the UN Secretary General in January raised pledges for more than $10 billion for flood recovery over the next 3 years. But there's a caveat there. The money is mostly in the form of project loans and repurposing existing funding. So while it has, generated the funds Pakistan needs, Pakistan actually went beyond the target it needed. There is a real caveat there as to sort of how those funds are going to come through. And if you're repurposing existing loans, you're taking away money from something that was already going to be, the money was already going to be used for. And the fact, if they're project loans, they have to be repaid, right? And so this is going to be, it's not just a blank check for a flood relief and recovery. So quickly now on the domestic kind of setup. The National Disaster Management Authority, I would say, was largely missing in action, especially in the early days of the flooding. They created a portal which did not work, embarrassingly, for the government. But the Ministry of Planning and Development, along with its flood coordination cell, and supported by sort of international organizations, multilateral agencies, created a post-disaster needs assessment that came out in October last year. And that was really sort of, that laid out the damages. And they basically said, came out with some numbers. The total damages exceed 15 billion. Total economic losses are about 15 billion, and I'm just rounding here, and estimated needs for rehab and reconstruction in a resilient way were at least $16 billion. That was the target they set for the International Conference on Climate Resistant Pakistan, the 16.3 billion. And then, and they said that Pakistan would fund about half of that, so about 8 billion. And then the rest would come through from other countries, and that's where they got pledges. Now, just to sort of end, a few notes about the domestic situation and where things stand. As I mentioned before, the UN's OCHA reports help, but this is not something the government is conveying effectively to the population. The media is also not covering this because of the fact that the flooding has occurred not in Pakistan's urban centers, not in areas where there's sort of sustained attention, but in sort of rural areas where people don't, these are areas that unfortunately Pakistan doesn't pay attention to anyway. There's a real lack of a rigorous, serious national conversation on this, both in the media as well as in parliament and in political circles. International media has shown a much brighter light on this, I would say, especially in the fall. But even most recently, I mean, the UN can put out numbers about who's still affected, and they say that 4.5 million people remain exposed or living close to where there's still standing water, and this is just as of February 1st. So those are important numbers. But again, the international media sort of shining light on actual stories is really important. And The Guardian actually had a report come out last week where it interviewed, some people in Sindh and in Dadu, sort of where one of the important parts of Sindh where there was just enormous damage. And these people are saying, we lost everything. Our houses are still flooded, and they're waiting for God to come and help them because they're not seeing any help from the government or relief agencies. And what they're living in tents, and what they received was 7,000 rupees in funding for a household which is barely anything, which is double digits in dollars, right? 7,000 rupees for a household one time from the Benazir Income Support Program, which is a cash transfer program that already exists. So, here are people in a desperate situation who say that they still haven't, despite all the advocacy the government has done abroad, the state has done abroad, despite pledges, people on the ground are still not seeing any kind of relief, let alone, the rebuilding and recovery that is required. I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I just want to do a quick sound check. Is everyone able to hear me? Madiha, Farwa, can I get a thumbs up? Okay. Some tree trimmers convened outside my window and decided this would be an excellent time to pull out the chainsaw. So apologies for any background noise you might be picking up. I want to briefly kind of reflect on some of what Farwa and Madiha has shared, add some of my own perspectives, and then transition to a few follow-up questions that I have for our panelists as we continue this conversation. Just a reminder to those of you tuning in, please do add your questions in the Q&A box. It looks like a couple have already come in, but look forward to turning to those here in a little bit. So like Madiha, I was actually in Pakistan around the time of the floods, though only in Islamabad, so wasn't able to see the impact. I was there in September though. And by that point, it was clear that this was in many ways an unprecedented event. A lot of the US officials who were visiting, Samantha Power was there at the same time. And, we were getting these reports and these visuals that at least speaking for myself, were almost hard to conceptualize, to see these images and recognize that what appeared to be a massive sea had previously been land, farmland, and people's homes, areas where livestock were living. And that carried over in many ways to the conversations that I was having in Islamabad. I tend to focus more on security issues in Pakistan and in South Asia. And so that was the tenor of many of my conversations. But obviously in the context, those talks, those meetings would begin with an acknowledgement of the situation that Pakistan found itself in. A third of the country underwater, over 30 million people impacted. But I have to say that, after that reflection, after pausing, the conversation would move on. And it would turn to many of the same topics that would have been talked about in many of the same terms previously, had this flood not happened. And that was really a disjunction that was striking to me, and that I think in my own mind has forced some reflection in terms of how we define security threats and prioritization going forward. Very often those conversations in Pakistan center on issues related to regional rivalries, right? The traditional rivalry with India specifically, nuclear issues, the threat of conventional conflict, as Madiha was mentioning, the challenges domestically from resurgent Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, and very infrequently do you hear about, what are sometimes known as non-traditional security issues in that mix. And when you think about the issues that are actually impacting the lives of Pakistanis more than anything right now, it is these natural disasters, rather than the more traditional focus of how we tend to define security issues. So I think, going forward in my mind, it was striking the extent that those conversations about the quote unquote traditional and non-traditional remain separate. And I think there is a deep need for reflection and perhaps some redefinition in the wake of these floods to consider how the more traditional security threats that do get the most attention in terms of resources, in terms of policymaker attention, in terms of news coverage, actually interact with non-traditional threats like climate change that going forward are going to become even more immediate. The other thing I've been reflecting on recently is this question of what comes next. Madiha was mentioning loss and damage as fundamentally a long-term conversation, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. There is the near-term relief and recovery that Pakistan received from the donors conference, but again, largely in the form of loans and sometimes repurposed loans rather than new money coming in. The loss and damage fund is, I think, a remarkable point and an achievement that Pakistan bears a lot of credit for in terms of moving that through the COP27 process, but it will take a significant amount of time before those funds are available. And so what strikes me is what happens in the interim, right, between the immediate relief and recovery efforts and the time when down the road, perhaps those loss and damage funds will be made available. And particularly given the extent to which attention has turned, as Farwa was noting earlier in the international community, there's now the horrific earthquake in Turkey that is driving resources and attracting a lot of attention. And so to my mind, it will really be a challenge for Pakistan's government at a time when, as Madiha was laying out, it faces an increasingly untenable economic situation to try to figure out how to prepare, how to recover. We don't know what the next year's monsoon will bring. Hopefully it won't be anything approaching the scale of what we saw this year. But I think that's a possibility that we have to keep in mind going forward. And it strikes me that there really is a need for not just long-term attention from policymakers, but creativity and a broader rethink in terms of how Pakistan distributes the resources that it does have within its budget to better account for the changing landscape of threats that the country as a whole faces. I think I will leave my thoughts there for now, but maybe if I could turn to both of you, perhaps Farwa first and then Madiha. One thing that I've been reflecting on in preparing for this webinar is trying to understand the balance of what's played out, right? So as I think both of you mentioned, Pakistan saw devastating flooding previously in 2010, though a different type of devastating flooding. So that was a river flood. It was quite different in impact, in duration, and in response than what we saw this time, which was largely, monsoon flooding on the plains, though there was a riparian angle to it as well in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But given that this was an unprecedented event in many ways in terms of scale, in terms of area of impact, in your minds, to what extent do you think this was a failure of imagination, of not being able to really conceive of a disaster of this scale? And to what extent was it a failure of governance in not planning effectively against this sort of outcome? Farwa, I'll turn to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and definitely really good reflections from you as well. And just to build on that, Just recent, adding to the list of studies that we just mentioned, refer to. One of the most recent studies come out of, I think, this is Newcastle University. It suggests that about 15 million people are at risk of being hit by floods this year from glacial lake outbursts from their natural dams because of the change in climate. And that's for South Asia and mostly Pakistan and India. So, there is definitely a risk of this phenomenon repeating itself, and in a magnanimous way, and unfortunately not, but that's something that we always have to keep in mind. And having said that, coming back to your question, like what was the balance of how much was it climate change and how much was it governance? I think it's both. Pakistan, as rightly pointed out, has never really acknowledged non-traditional security threats as something that has to be profiled, that has to be prioritized, and has to be allocated, budget towards. And that's why infrastructure-wise, we don't have climate proofing. If you look at an urban center, I've been born and raised in Karachi, and that's one of the most notable metropolitan centers in Pakistan and the commercial heart of Pakistan. The infrastructural damage that I've seen growing up every time you have a period of monsoon rain is definitely recognizable. The roads get damaged, the basements get flooded, shops, whether commercial basements, whether homes, they get flooded. We live in, my family home is in the Defense Housing Security, which is basically an army housing society. And even there was like millions in damages that people had to contest. And they claimed for it, they never got it back. And these were all because this was a natural disaster. And unfortunately, the authorities did not take the responsibility. And even despite like these episodes happening year after year, of course, not as magnanimous as the one last year, there was little improvement made. We don't have a system of any sort of like infrastructure governance that kind of sees through what is going to be the climate change forecast going forward, how is going to impact the country, cities, urban centers, rural centers. Same goes when like my work centers a lot on water. And when we talk about water scarcity and looking at just the water projections for the country and how it's going to run, the taps are going to run dry by 2050, it was 2030, and looking at the Indus River and what have you. It always comes down to how unfair the system is in terms of its equitable distribution and management within cities and within states, and then going on to national levels, despite having organizations like VAPTA, despite having organizations like NDMA that we talked about. So there's definitely going to be that at the front and center, in front and center of these conversations, that how well do countries behave, recognizing that nature is kind of like it's raging war. But then again, how much climate change is expected to affect? That's an evolving factor. It's exacerbating worldwide. Europe had record-breaking heat waves last year. There are droughts that are happening worldwide. It's now going to be unstoppable in many ways. And what we need to, and I always have to say this, the time for prevention, unfortunately, is gone. All we have right now is to dedicate efforts and whatever resources that we have towards mitigation and adaptation. And that's why, talking about techniques and strategies and mechanisms like early warning systems, they're very important. In the World Meteorological Organization, when I was sitting in the UN stakeholder consultations for the water conference that's coming up next year, they had announced that they're going to set up, say, a series of early warning systems in regions that are vulnerable to monsoons or flooding episodes and other disasters. So that's something to keep in mind for sure, and also to understand that climate proofing or making mechanisms or plans going forward, dam building is not everything, which is something that Pakistan unfortunately has always kind of like put as a front runner in terms of solutions, like building, whether it's the Aamer Pasha Dam or it's a Kalabagh Dam, that that is going to help. But there are other solutions that one needs to look into, and that is to kind of like work around upgrading that colonial age irrigation system and the drainage system. So yeah, I'm just going to stop there. Madiha.
I think Farwa covered a lot. So I would say I think it's an excellent question. Whether it's a governance failure or a natural disaster failure, it is both. I think at some point there was so much rain that there just wasn't anywhere else for the water to go. But so, the government could not have prevented this natural disaster. But there is a governance failure in the fact that people weren't told to evacuate, right? So these 1,700 deaths did not need to happen. The number could have been, much smaller. So early warning systems, as Farwa pointed to, are key here, right? And the fact that after 2010, Pakistan sort of hasn't set those up properly. That's important. The construction that happens, sort of illegal construction on riverbeds. I mean, in August, sort of one of the first images where people really realized what was happening was that I think it was called the New Honeymoon Hotel in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, just literally getting washed away in the flooding, right? The fact of the matter is that it should not have been constructed where it was. And so sort of those were things that obviously would have, measures that would have helped, right? So, Pakistan did not do what it needed to do post 2010 in a, by the way, I'll say a far better economic and political environment than exists currently. It did not do what it needed to do in terms of adaptation, mitigation efforts. And so you have the governance failures exacerbating the extent of the natural disaster. But then where it's clear governance failures is in the response also, right? So there's sort of that immediate kind of time frame, and then there's a response, and we are now 6 months out. And the fact of the matter is that you still don't see, as I mentioned, sort of a concerted national conversation on what it is the country can do. I mean, the climate change ministry, while it's got some attention abroad for its efforts, is a really underfunded ministry in Pakistan. This is not a ministry on which there is much focus within the country, right? And so, we have seen all this discussion about, the more than $10 billion that are now going to go into sort of building, sort of a sustainable recovery. Pakistan's foreign minister talked about building back better. In sort of the context of flood recovery. But I, again, have yet to see how that's going to be implemented. And the worry in sort of the context I laid out is that Pakistan's many crises are going to impede its building back better. And the fact of the matter also, I will say, is that there's an election coming up. This year, one thing we did not talk about is the fact that Pakistan, the structure of the way things are done is that, yes, Pakistan, has a federal national disaster management authority, but it has a lot of power devolved to the provinces. And the province that was most affected by this is Sindh. Rural Sindh, by the way, politics actually plays a role here. The people of rural Sindh say, again, in sort of all of this anecdotal evidence that's coming out of, out of these areas through reporters, they're basically saying, the politicians don't come to us other than for the elections. Sindh is basically ruled by one party, that's the Pakistan People's Party, especially rural Sindh, that's sort of its stronghold. And there really isn't too much incentive because there's no political competition in rural Sindh, there really isn't too much incentive to provide, or to improve outcomes for the people there. So, again, these farmers, these poor people who are still living displaced in tents say that the landed have been able to get resources while the poor, and the displaced have not. And those are important things to remember. And actually, I mean, I should just sort of lay it out here that the Guardian article ended saying the Sindh government did not respond to requests for comment. So the Sindh government has been denying the fact that, either not responding or denying the fact that, this has not, the relief and recovery has not really been reaching the most vulnerable population. So just, some things to note going ahead.
No, that's really helpful. Thanks to both of you for those thoughts. Maybe Farwa, if I could turn to you specifically, I know you have kind of technical expertise in terms of early warning systems, for example, and other solutions that have been developed and applied elsewhere that could be of assistance going forward in Pakistan. I want to bring in a question actually from our mutual colleague, Brian Eiler at Stenson. So he asks, what kind of urgent action can be done in the near term to reduce damage? So what if the coming monsoons next summer bring similar levels of precipitation? What can be done now to assess risk and provide early warning? And any other kind of immediate preparatory steps that you would recommend? Curious.
Yeah, thank you. Oh wait, can you hear me? All right, super. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Brian, for that question. So early warning systems is definitely something that has gained a lot more visibility and a lot more prominence given the nature of natural disasters. They are helpful tools just for communicating disasters, especially in remote areas and in a country like Pakistan, which has several remote areas and several communities that are not directly connected to the main cities or communication channels. For them to be able to have this communication or dissemination or disaster awareness by way of an early warning system can save lives, can save jobs, can be a huge benefit in terms of both humanitarian and socioeconomic side of things. So to be able to put those into place, we've seen good examples of it, whether it's, I mentioned Nepal earlier in my remarks, that they've put in a lot of work ever since the Milamchi flood disaster that happened to them in 2017. And there have been work since then in different parts of Nepal, and similarly, learning from Nepal in other parts of South Asia, there in India and in Northeast India, there have been examples and best practices taken from there, and it kind of implemented in sites that were vulnerable to flooding or landslides or dam breaching, on how early warning systems can help the communities. And they have paid they paid their returns really well, both in short term and long term. Now, for Pakistan to be able to do that, there are two things. The conflict is, do we go by working with the governments directly, or the ministries under the government, or do we go by working with the NGOs and the civil society organizations? Ideally, to make this a more equitable, functioning, and effective early warning system sort of a framework or other way of disaster communication, it has to be done with both coming together. It has to be like a multi-stakeholder approach where you're able to connect to, from provinces, from low-lying, Sindh to up north, as we've seen the devastation kind of scale the entire country. So to be able to connect the different parts of Pakistan together. And for that, you need ample data. You need that kind of transparent data coming out of provinces, coming out of localities, coming out of communities, cities. And in that, to Madiha's point, you will need the support of the provincial governments. You will need donor community to support CSOs and funding, research that you can get timely data. You can set up local data stations. You can have community engagement. You can go down to different parts of the provinces and to be able to get the right kind of scope it as to what needs to be done and then cater to it. We have aspirations to do it on our end here at the Stimson Center, and we would love to work with partners to kind of like facilitate that process and put them into practice. But again, In addition to early warning systems, there are a lot of other things that need to be done and could be taken into account that are economically feasible. There's one part that we forgot to kind of mention is that when we talk about climate change, we talk about the failure in governance and failure in, kind of like making sure that there was enough awareness and time of preventive mechanisms, was that there was deforestation and there was also, the mangroves and other sort of nature-based solutions that were being eradicated that could have helped mitigate some of the impacts of this massive flooding. So to be able to invest into a more healthy ecosystem and to be able to invest into nature-based solutions is another way to look at curbing the impacts of or the ramifications of such natural disasters. And one thing that I do want to mention and commend is the Living Indus initiative, which is being run under Sherry Rahman, the Minister of Climate Change, and it is all about kind of like building that healthy ecosystem, facilitating the ecological biodiversity and all of the Indus River. So those are steps in the right direction, but you need a lot more to be done.
Thanks, Farwa. Madiha, I want to give you an opportunity to weigh in on that question as well, perhaps more from kind of the political or economic lens. And here I will incorporate a question from an anonymous attendee who points out what you reference in your remarks, right? Pakistan isn't able at this time to increase government expenditures, especially for things like infrastructure reconstruction. We haven't seen, including at the donors conference, an influx necessarily in new funding. Much of it is in the form of loans or even repurposed loans. And so in that context, with this risk going forward, that be it this coming year or in years ahead, we will see floods of this scale again. What needs to happen politically, economically, in terms of the governance side of this equation for Pakistan to be in a better situation, both having recovered from these floods and prepared to manage the impact of the next floods?
Right. When the donors conference happened, the sort of this current economic spiral had begun. It had stopped briefly in the fall because Pakistan got back onto the IMF program only to get off it again, right? But this current the donors conference in January happened in that context. And I was really surprised by people saying, well, will this money actually help Pakistan avert default? And the clear answer that anybody should have known was that money doesn't go towards Pakistan averting default. Pakistan is not going to pay back its loans using these pledges, right? And so that the concept that money that Pakistan is generating for flood recovery, right, for building resilience going forward, that is separate money from the money Pakistan needs in order for its economy to sputter along and finally get back onto some kind of track. And because these are separate things, in some sense, what we need is for the government to treat them as such, right? And so empower the ministries, climate change, I think Ministry of Planning and Development, the Disaster Management Authority, if that is, and there are provincial versions of that, the provincial ministries that will actually need to implement some of this, empower them to undertake the projects that need to be undertaken, along with, I think there is a lot of help from the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, the UN, they're all willing and able to, and have been helping in this regard. So actually just, in some sense, drown out all the chaos and the noise that exists in the Pakistani context, hard as it may be, and empower essentially the bureaucrats here and the ministries at the national level that will then disseminate this funding to the provincial level to go about and do their work in consultation with sort of the technical expertise that the UN, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and all the other agencies that are involved with this can provide, and have that be in some sense a bucket separate from everything else that is going on with its politics and its economy. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that this has to be done with transparency, right? So it's very important both within Pakistan domestically, where there's always allegations of misappropriation and corruption, and for the donor community to do this in a way that is transparent. And so that is something that the government, the federal government, as well as the provincial authorities that will be focusing on this, will have to prioritize. But this is easier said than done, right? It requires political will, it requires focus. But Pakistan has extremely talented people in its non-leadership positions, whose talents can be harnessed along with the technical expertise that others are providing in order to implement this going forward. Given how much attention has been raised on this topic sort of at the world stage, given that the conference happened in Geneva, I think there is a certain amount of pressure. I mean, in some sense, this has gone beyond the attention the 2022 floods have received, certainly have gone beyond the attention the 2010 flooding received, and that the government was able to generate. And so that kind of puts pressure on the government to actually deliver on the funding it's received. It is going to receive, because I don't think a lot of it has come through yet, but that it is going to receive and actually, sort of do right by it.
It's a great point, Madiha. Thank you both. Turning back to Farwa now, a question from a viewer named Mohammed Hasnain, who wants to hear a little bit more about this concept of living with floods, right? Recognizing this new context that we're in. Farwa, you were mentioning earlier the Living Indus project and ways that using the local ecosystem across the country, it might be possible to help to at least focus on climate adaptation and find natural strategies for mitigating some climate impact. But just to push a little bit further, right? We don't know if floods of this scale are likely to recur anytime soon, certainly hope not. But based on the patterns that we're seeing over time in Pakistan, not just with the flooding, but with water scarcity, with increasing temperatures, all of these really, I think, coalescing challenges from climate change that are seeing an incredibly intense impact in Pakistan. It's one of the most climate affected countries and regions in the world. We've already seen people voting with their feet, right? Climate migration is a reality in many ways within Pakistan. And I wonder, going forward, what is your assessment of how much we are going to be able to adapt to and manage the impact of flooding along these lines and broader climate impacts? And to what extent and when the conversation might need to shift in terms of recognizing the reality of climate-related displacement and ensuring that those communities most impacted are facilitated and have support in adapting and finding ways of continuing their lives and livelihoods in the context of climate change?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. There are two parts to this. The first is Pakistan ready to take in the brunt of climate migration, climate refugees? Most certainly not. We've talked about it throughout this past 1 hour on how economically, politically fragile the country is at this moment, especially in the year when the elections are going to happen. There's a lot of politics that always is going to be around the campaign, where whatever is the issue of the current times will be championed and everything else will take the back seat. And media as well follows the same sort of framework where they only support what's kind of the conversation that is current, but everything else is neglected. And with climate migration, climate refugees, and internally displaced people, whether it's through other areas and other security-related issues, those are all going to be further take a toll on the economic side of things for Pakistan. We definitely have to live with, and when I say we, I mean, we take this conversation broader, take it away from Pakistan and take the entire international community into perspective. The entire world now needs to live with the fact that climate disasters are a reality. What we would talk about and consider as non-traditional security threats are international, globally recognized security threats, whether it's water, whether it's climate change, whether it's energy crises, and how all of these are actually very interconnected. So what happened as a result of the invasion of Ukraine, you could see those translate into fuel prices and food insecurity, food prices going up throughout the world. So what starts in one part of the world doesn't necessarily stay contained in that part of the world. The entire population around the world experiences it, faces it in one way or the other. So we have to be prepared, and we have to kind of keep that in mind. There are different ways on how we can be a little bit better at being prepared. We've talked about the big picture. We talked about how, authorities can play a role and how, but kind of like giving civil society organizations a little bit more of a, front seat in the decision-making table, having technical and the scientific community participate more in these conversations that eventually lead to climate and water policy discourse, so that they are part of the solution. They are actually helping these authorities keep up with more timely data, most up-to-date kind of like solution systems that are out there. So to keep up with that. And when it comes down to, bottom level engagement, we talk about grassroots communities or marginalized communities, what can be done to facilitate? A lot of people, I think from the farmer community, which has a lot to contribute to the GDP being number one, we talked about the women, and we talked about young children who, Pakistan and the whole of South Asia, it's a very young population. So whatever you are going to be able to develop today for the betterment of the children is going to be what Pakistan will look like in the coming years. So to be able to cater to that, raising awareness, providing vocational training, providing equipping them with the skill set that might be needed for example, for evacuation techniques, drills for evacuation, what kind of farming you need to do, knowing that water scarcity is going to be a challenge. So should we move towards, less water intensive cropping so you can contain can mitigate the impacts and you can continue with your economic livelihoods being sustained. I'd love to give this example, but Jordan, how do you work around things that are problematic in your city and your country? Jordan has had, it has severe water problem, but it also, coupled with the water problem, has a notorious problem of leakages. The pipelines, they have this notorious leakage issue. So before the water even gets to the household, much of it has leaked. So what they did was, a couple of years ago, the Ministry of Water Resources in Jordan, with the help of the UN and other international partners, they went through this exercise where they provide training to women of the household and communities to become plumbers. So they didn't have to wait on outsource these plumbers to come in and fix their problems because they were so much in demand. They could just fix a problem within their house themselves. They didn't have to wait on this. And this allowed them to be more empowered, to feel at par with their male counterparts, and also provided economic opportunities with them for them. So this is how you kind of equip people to become a part of the solution. So these are some of the ways you can work around this, and there's so many lessons. Of course, you can't use a cookie cutter approach that what's worked in Jordan will work perfectly well in Pakistan. It would be like Lahore would benefit from this or Islamabad. You can't. Of course, it has to be catered to the fabric of the city or the country and the community, but something to be inspired by, and that needs more connectivity across regions, connectivity across the globe, and to have conversations like what we're having, whether it's COP, it's a great platform. I wish it did more. And then the UN Water Conference that's happening this year. I mean, we can always have high hopes.
Thanks, Farwa. As we wrap up here, unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. I want to turn to Madiha for any thoughts you have on that question, as well as one that we've received from Anna Bigelow. You've actually already addressed one part of her question in terms of
the role of NGOs and challenges that NGOs face in kind of staying out of politics in some ways. But maybe to flip the conversation on its head, we've talked about the impacts of politics on flooding. How do you see the impact of flooding on politics? So Pakistan is heading into election season. You mentioned the PPP stronghold in rural parts of Sindh, and with the feudal setup there, perhaps not as many election impacts as you might imagine, but curious to hear a little bit more for your thoughts on if and how the floods are likely to play out in the coming election season, and any things you'll be watching for going forward to assess the impact of kind of this relationship between politics and flooding going forward.
That's a really interesting question. You know, one thing that I was mentioning, sort of, or wanted to mention earlier when I mentioned that there was an election this year, is the fact that this will affect policy continuity, right? So what this government starts implementing in terms of flood recovery with the funding that starts to come in, it will be important to see whether there is policy continuity in terms of whether the next government, if it's a different one, continues that. And of course, policy continuity in Sindh is far more likely because Sindh has been a PPP stronghold, but policy continuity at the federal level is unlikely in a context in Pakistan where power switches, from one party to the other, where there's an incumbency disadvantage at the federal level, right? So just something to keep in mind. Unfortunately, sort of in the context that I was laying out, the fact is that politics has distracted away from focused attention in Pakistan on flooding. And flooding, the flooding catastrophe in itself is unlikely to be a major player in the election. In Sindh, I would say that if in rural Sindh there were options, right, other than the PPP, perhaps this would lead people to switch away. Certainly in Turkey, right? This example, with the earthquake right now, there's already a lot of sort of reporting coming out that this may actually affect, the earthquake may actually affect Erdogan's chances. People are really, really angry at the response, right? But because that's a different context, because it's a very centralized kind of context, right? And they can sort of direct anger at the federal government. In Pakistan, things are a little bit different because it's sort of a parliamentary system, and PPP may still get Sindh, and it may not affect outcomes at the federal level directly. The caveat is the flooding has exacerbated, of course, the economic situation in Pakistan, right? So I talked about the economic situation sort of as a given, right? And because the flooding has not been the major contributor to the economic situation, but it has exacerbated it. So it has exacerbated inflation. The fact of the matter is that the cotton crop getting destroyed has been really, really harmful for people, but also on a macro level. In Pakistan, the inflationary pressure is likely to continue over the next few months, and that in itself, the economic situation is certainly going to affect the election outcome. So much as in Pakistan, it's usually something or the other. It's sort of politics sometimes seems to exist in kind of a vacuum. In this situation, sort of the quote, it's the economy, stupid. I mean, I actually really see, there's sort of the political, military, civil military machinations that may end up playing a great role, right? Trying to disqualify one party versus the other, that's kind of what always happens in the Pakistani context. But if you actually really try to get a pulse of the country right now, it is that people are angry and they are hurting, and this is because of the economy. And to the extent that the flooding has exacerbated the economic crisis, it will affect outcomes. And that is, I think, what the incumbent government is worried about, right? It honestly did not have, a long runway, and it has had a natural disaster, an economic crisis, and political opposition in this runway. And the elections will definitely be something to watch in Pakistan this year.
All right, couldn't agree more. Lots still yet to discuss. I wish we had more time, but I've learned a great deal from both of you today, and look forward to opportunities to continue this conversation down the road. For today, though, I will bring our discussion to a close with great thanks to Stanford, to APARC, to Stanford Global Studies, to our convener today, Lalita Duparon, and to Simrath Kaur Matharu for all of the tech assistance. It's really been a pleasure, and thank you so much to our fellow panelists, to those of you who have joined us today. Be well, take care. Thank you.